What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to take a look at do, try, catch, how to use it, what it is, and all that good stuff. So here we are on swift.org, and we've got a bunch of examples here of what a do, try, catch statement entails. We're going to start with a playground and essentially talk about the basics, and then we'll jump into a project and take a look at how to use it in the wild with a more practical example. That said, make sure you destroy the like button as always. If you're a returning viewer and haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button so we can grow the channel together. Get excited, open up Xcode, and let's dig in.
Quick pause before we get into the video. If you haven't seen it already, I am hard at work putting together iOSacademy.io, a community where all of us iOS engineers can come together, learn how to build some of the top apps like Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, in addition to interview prep to land some of these iOS roles at top tech companies. So if you're interested in the free and premium content to come, head on over to iOSacademy.io and enter your email address in the waitlist form, and you will be notified as content becomes available. That said, let's get into the video.
We're going to start with opening up Xcode, and we're going to come to File, New, and we're going to create a new playground. And we're going to stick with a blank playground. That's just fine. Let's go ahead and call this do, catch, throw. And we'll save it to our desktop. And let me just expand this window in a moment to give ourselves a little more room to work. And let's jump into it. So the premise of a do catch statement is quite simple, and it's very related to handling errors. So let's start talking about errors first. So we can model our own errors in an enum. So for example, let's say we have a custom error enum, and we would basically have it conform to an error. And in here, we can provide our own error cases. So I'm going to go ahead and create 3 that are just some random errors. Error, let's just say loading error. We'll say fetching error, and we will say unknown error. So let's say in your application, you're trying to do something, and a function has the potential to run into any of these 3 errors. So traditionally, what people will do is you could use something like a closure and a completion handler to find out if an error occurred or something like that. However, what you can leverage instead of that approach is a do catch statement and a throw. So let's take a look at the throw part of it before we do the do catch. So let's say we have a func called do something. And let's say it's supposed to return a string, but it could also throw an error, right? So let's say it's supposed to go to the network and maybe get some data, but it might run into some hiccup. So instead of returning a string, we might want to just throw an error. So what we want to add here is throws. And actually, if we take a look at the, actually, I guess it doesn't show you down here in Xcode 12, but basically what throws does is it basically tells the compiler that this function can throw an error. Now it's complaining down here because we've said that this function will return a string and we didn't supply one. So let's just supply a generic string here. So this throws is actually all it takes to tell the requesting side, so whoever calls this function, that you might get an error back. So let's talk about a do catch and how it's related to this. And we'll take a look at an example in a moment. So let's say we have a function and it's called viewDidLoad. You might have seen this from a standard view controller in your app. And let's say you want to call it do something. And as you start typing in do something, you can see the signature is it throws and it returns a string, right? It could throw and return a string. So let's say we put this here, result equals this. You'll see that we actually will get a warning, if not an error right here, saying that call can throw, but it is not marked with a try and the error is not handled. So what does this mean? This is basically saying, kind of like the error kind of sums up, this call may or may not return a string. It actually might throw an error, but you're not handling it. So it's saying, mark this with a try. Okay, we marked it with a try. Let's see what it says now. We still have an error because we're trying to do something, but we are not handling the errors. So to get around that error, you could make this a try optional. And this way, your result here will be either a string or nil. So in this case, we kind of ignore the errors. But let's say we wanted to account for the errors. That's where a do catch statement comes in. So a do catch statement's signature is as follows. And basically, we just move the try line into here and we drop the optionality, so get rid of that question mark. So now we see there's no error here. It is going to complain, it's going to give us a warning that we're not using results. So let's just print out result for the sake of getting rid of that warning. And let's talk about this syntax. So basically, how do you read a do try catch statement? So the analogy that I like to give for those who are kind of learning and trying to understand this is, imagine there's two people. One person is the requester and the other person is going to do something. The idea is person A hands a task to person B, and person B might hand the result back, aka a string, or person B might hand the task back to the requester and say, hey, I can't do it, something went wrong, aka an error is thrown. So what you're saying here is the doer is saying, hey, can you do something? In this case, the function is actually called do something, which worked out kind of nice. And the reason we're saying try is go ahead and try to do this. If it doesn't work, give me the error back and we're going to catch the error in here. And you can actually print out the error. And actually, you can even specify directly what type of error you want to catch. So you could catch the given type of error. You can specify the type with the given actual error case. We're not going to do that. We're just going to keep it generic like this. And we're simply going to print out the error that we get. So let me go ahead and run this playground. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-Y, which will open up our console down here. And let's hit this play button. And we expect to see a print of hello world. Sometimes playgrounds decide to not be useful and not work half the time. Actually, I forgot to call this function. So let me go ahead and pause this. And let's call this function down here. And let's hit play again. And we expect to see hello world, which we do. Awesome. The reason we see it is because this function simply returns hello world. Now, what if we throw an error? So let's go ahead and look at how do we actually throw an error. So you would expect that we can do a return error of the error type, and that's actually not what we want to do. We're not actually returning an error because the return type is a string. We actually want to throw an error. And you simply do it with the keyword throw, and it'll actually complain that this return will never be called. In a real world scenario, you would have some logic in here. So we can actually just leave that warning there. And we're going to be printing out this error here. So let me go ahead and hit pause here. Hit Command K to clear out our console and hit the play button again. And we see that this time we got a loading error printed out. And it's actually being printed out from in here. So we're going to say got an error. And we're going to do that. And let me go ahead and pause and rerun this. And you'll see we go into got an error. So that's basically the premise of a do try catch. So other languages kind of call this try catch. Very similar syntax, slightly different. So let's jump into a project and take a look at a real world example. All right, so I'm going to come up here and hit File, New, and we're going to create a new project here. Let's come down here and hit Project. We're going to stick with a single view application. Make sure your language is Swift, most importantly, and your interface is Storyboard, even though we're not doing any interface stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and call this project do try catch in the wild. And let me go ahead and save this. We'll put it on my desktop for the time being. And let's work through a more practical example. So the example that I'm going to go through here, we're not going to actually run the app, but just for semantics sake, to help better explain this concept, we're going to go through an example in which a user, or rather a developer, you, would want to fetch some data from an API. So let's say we had a function here, and we call it getData from API, and it takes a URL string. And let's say it's going to return data to us. Rather, instead of return, it's going to have a completion handler. and this will return, it's going to be escaping firstly, and this will return data. Otherwise, it'll return void. And in here, we're going to do things, and this function might throw. So we're going to put throws at the end of this here. And essentially, the first thing we want to do in this function is we want to try to convert this string to a URL. So we're going to say guard let URL is URL with a string, passing in that URL string. And if it isn't able to convert it to a URL, we're going to throw an error. We're going to throw a API error, invalid URL. Let's go ahead and create this API error enum. So I'll create this here. And here we're going to simply add invalid, what did I call it? Invalid URL. So there's that statement. Next up, we can actually create the task to call the API off of the URL session. So I'm just using the URL session as an example. In this case, it's not really related to do, try, catch. It's just a good example. So we're going to call it with the given URL. Completion handler takes data, URL response, and an error. So we're going to say data response error. And what's interesting about this is it actually already has an error in it. So we can say if let error equals error, we can throw the error. Else, if let data equals data, we can simply call the completion handler and pass in data. And it's complaining that we're not using task. So basically what we want to do is come down here and say task dot resume. Let's see, looks like we've got an issue somewhere. Let's look at this error and see what it's saying. This error is saying invalid conversion from a throwing function of type data URL response error throws void to non-throwing function type. So interesting. This is a good thing that I accidentally got into in this example. So we're actually throwing in the context of this block, right? So this is an async closure. And when we throw in here, we're actually throwing to this function, which is the completion handler. And this completion handler doesn't actually throw. So we can't actually even throw in here. So what we could do in this case is we can pass in completion, let's say nil here, and make this data in our completion handler optional. And this error will go away like so. And it's complaining we're not using this error here now, but let's ignore that for a quick minute. And let's look at the calling side of this function. So let's say in view.load, I wanted to call this function, and we're going to say, in a do statement, we're going to say try to get data with a URL, and let's pass in some random string that's not a valid URL, and completion returns data in, and we're going to have a catch statement here, and we're simply going to print out if an error occurs. So notice this function is slightly different from our function in the playground in the sense that this function doesn't actually return anything. This function takes a second parameter as a completion handler. We can actually get rid of this return statement here as well because the throw will inherently return. And let's just go ahead and say if error doesn't equal nil to get rid of that warning as well. And let's actually go ahead and run this app. And let's see if we get this error printed out. So I'm going to come up here and pick a simulator. So let's pick something different. Let's go with the iPhone 8. And let's hit the play button. And what we expect to see happen is we expect to see an error printed out in our console. So if you hit Command-Shift-Y, you'll open up the debugger down here. And this is building and launching. And hopefully it launches fairly quickly here. So this is a great way to kind of defensive program, so to say, right? So you can handle errors. You can be very specific with what went wrong. Now, some people ask if this approach is better than a completion handler. Why couldn't you just pass your error back in the completion handler? And the answer to that question is you absolutely can. It's a little bit of preference. It's a little bit of stylistic choices, you'll see that Apple themselves use both approaches. So we've got this launched here, and we should see an error down here. Let's see, do try catch in the wild. We've got a task that we've started. And let's see, we're throwing an error. Not too sure if we're printing it down here. So let me put a prefix to this, got an error. And let's put this in here. Let's try that one more time. Let's search for it. So it looks like we're actually not getting that print statement, which is interesting. So let me put a print in here called completion. And let's go ahead and run this again. We should definitely be getting one of those print statements out. So it looks like it's calling the completion handler. So first and foremost, let's see. So we're passing in a URL string, and we're trying to create a URL from it. So this one should be going into the else block, but it looks like it's not. And let's see why. So we're passing in text here. Let's pass in an empty string. And it should be going into that else of that guard statement. So here we can take a look and we see we got an error for invalid URL. So passing in a string here looks like it is able to construct a string with text, which is why it was coming down here. But in this case, because we straight up passed a empty string, we're going to the catch statement and we're saying we passed in an invalid URL. So this way we could potentially log this in some type of debug logs, and it's very helpful to see the reason why this call failed, right? Seeing that this failed is useful to a degree. Seeing why it failed is far more useful in terms of us going into the code and actually fixing a problem. So that's basically a do catch at its core. And the last thing I'll share before wrapping up this video is there's a very common do try catch scenario that you'll definitely use if you're touching anything with APIs in your app. And that's converting JSON data from an API call to a struct. So I'm just going to quickly show an example here. So let's say you have a struct of response, and you make it codable. And this basically should match your JSON response if you're familiar with codable. I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. But basically, let's say you get some data back from an API call. We'll just mock it here. And you want to basically convert the data to a response. You can actually do it in a do catch statement with one of Apple's built-in APIs. And basically the way it looks is as follows. You try to use a JSON decoder to decode a response from the data. And if it doesn't successfully do the conversion and the decode, it throws an error. And you can catch an error here. So this is the exact same syntax we looked at before. It's giving us a warning because we're not using results. But this is a great example that Apple has baked into Swift, of course. Very common task of converting bytes from the network to one of your models, or a struct in this case. So JSON decoder tries to decode the data to this guy. If it's not able to, it's going to complain, and it'll throw an error that we catch in here. So this is by far the absolute most common example of a do, try, catch. So that said, I think this video has gotten longer than I anticipated, so I'll wrap it up here. Make sure you destroy that like button as always. Hit subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Comment down below with any questions, suggestions, future video ideas. Love hearing from you guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.